Hello, I'm Joshua of Milestone Play, and I am a professional game master. Today we're going to talk about story in role-playing games. More specifically, whose story is being told and whose story is being told. And how whose story is being told affects whose story is being told. It's going to make sense, I promise. Okay, so what am I talking about and how did I get here? I run a lot of different role-playing games throughout the week and all of them play differently. And I recently had an experience that has caused me to kind of reapproach the subject of whose story is being told from actually a source outside of role-playing games. I recently just finished the book Gossamer by Lois Lowry. This book was suggested to me by a close friend of mine, and they suggested it to me as just a fun, really simple, like little kids chapter book to read based off of some other games that I've actually worked on. So for those of you who don't know, I do have a Patreon. You can find it in the description. And one of the major things that you'll find down there are different homebrew systems in development that some of them I'm working to get on getting to the state of publishing, but there's a bunch of different ones where as I have different ideas for different stories, I come up with different systems to tell those stories. Now, one of those stories is about fairies and fairies in a fairy garden in a cul-de-sac, and it's a really simple lower fantasy game. And based off of developing that system and playing with those ideas, my friend suggested Gossamer to me as this is another story about fairies that bring you dreams at night and all those things, and it's a wonderful story. If you have the time for it, I suggest you read it. It's very short. It's very easy reading level. But when I finished reading the book, I had this weird epiphany moment of finishing a story that was not mine. And, I've read a bunch of books growing up and all that, but either the stories have either been of books assigned to me in class or books that I bought or occasionally books that I got from the library that had that bit of, I chose this, I got this, and yes, I read it and then returned it, but for whatever reason, this might be the first book I have ever read that I had somebody else come to me going, hey, you would really like this. I really like this book. I think you'd like it too. You should read it. And them lending me the book and me reading their book, their story, the story that they grew up with. And so beginning to think about that, I began to think about the different games that I run, the different campaigns that I run, either for home games or professional games. And in the context of, this isn't my book, even though it's a story that I now have internalized within me, this isn't my book. And yet it's a story that, I've engaged with and I've enjoyed. And then comparing that to the campaigns that I run and asking the question, whose book are these? Whose stories are these? And you can think of whose story a campaign is in terms of like, who are the main characters? Who's the driving force? Is this a player-driven group, or is this a pre-established campaign group? Is this a published campaign narrative that we're playing through? All these sorts of things. And yeah, so I just want to share these thoughts about how that context affects how I think about a handful of my different games. So the first campaign I want to talk about is one of my current campaigns, and it is a player-driven story. Most of these players I have already run a 1.5-year campaign for, and this is now our second campaign that we're a good ways into. And one of the things that they requested for this game is for there to be a through-line narrative, but it's still very much about their characters. And their characters, their backstories all have this similar threads that I can kind of pull in and create a through line, but at no point am I forcing that through line. I am bringing up stuff from their backstories, but as much as possible, I'm trying to allow for the players to explore the world, push in different directions, and follow the narratives that the players are pushing for, as opposed to, yeah, I know you want to go to that castle, but we're going to deal with this first. I'm very much trying to follow the things that the players are pushing forward and have it be a very player-driven game, a very player-focused, player-prerogative game. And the ironic thing about that is we have recently had a moment in the game where it may not have felt like the players' choices mattered, where it may have felt like whatever the players did, I would then contrive a reason for that not to work, and that it would be my story and not theirs. And that was not the intention. There were things that I had built up ahead of time that would lead to the results that had happened in that given session. But in the moment, it did not feel like that. And that is not a feeling that I want the players to feel. But it is a moment where, even with the intention of this being a player-driven game, that it felt as if it wasn't. And so there's this moment of like, whoa, 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 whose story is this? Like, yeah, this is a homebrew campaign world. This is, something that I am making, but I very much want this to be player-driven and the player's story and the player's ownership. But we had this moment where that didn't feel like it was happening. And after clearing up the situation, explaining where I was coming from in some of the encounter design and things like that, the air is very much cleared, and having that very open conversation is very good, but there was still that moment. And so, yeah, we have this very player-driven campaign, but then I also have some other campaigns that, while I want it to be the player's story and the player's choices matter, it starts to fall away from that being the only focus. So the second campaign I want to mention is actually a game where the entire campaign started from a player having an in-person gaming one-shot experience with me. They were very much wowed at the experience, and they wanted to know what a full-term, long-term campaign with me would be like in my own world. With what I could do in just a one-shot, what would a full campaign look like, feel like? And they gathered together players that wanted a very custom homebrew personal experience. And some of these players very much don't like published, bought campaigns where you're running through the same story. They want something super unique. They want the game master's hands all over the campaign experience. And in this regard, this second campaign, where yes, it's still player focused and I want to highlight the characters and their backstories and their actions, I have players that are coming to me wanting my game, my story, my world. And that kind of shifts the structure where the player characters are the protagonists of the story. They're the focus of the story. We are telling their story. But in some aspects, it's my story. It's the things that I want to highlight, the things that I want to generate and produce, and the players looking at me to see what else I can contrive for them and what I can build for them to explore. And so there is that shift away from everything is the player characters to it is the player character's story, but it's my structure. It's what I'm building, and what I am building that affects the story that those player characters can be in. And so we start to shift away from it just being player character focused. And from there we go to a third campaign. This one I'm actively running right now is my vintage D&D series, where we go through a bunch of old modules and then we're playing them in 5th edition D&D, but we're trying to play through as many of those old modules as possible. Now I'm trimming out a lot of the side quests, some of the more deep content. That way we can get through the bulk of the main story faster. These players don't have as much time to play. They don't play every week in a row. It's typically every other week, things like that. So trying to barrel through as many of the old adventures as possible, hitting the main things. But when we do that, even if I am building a narrative that flows from adventure to adventure to adventure, all of a sudden the structure of the game, being about these old modules, kind of becomes the focus of the game. Yes, the player characters are experiencing it and going through it, and their choices might affect the hue, the color of the ending scenes and how they deal with the encounters along the way, but the structure of the modules becomes the main owner of the game. It's not even my game, it's the modules game. And then this is the player character's version of the modules. And especially some of these modules, as you go into them, getting into some of the dungeons are super linear. And not even like, yeah, you can sprawl the dungeon, but you find the end. some of the dungeons are, oh, we have to gather these 3 things, and we have to teleport into space 1, go through its linear path, get the thing. Essentially, it's a challenge of survive the path, and then you go back to the hub, and then go into Area 2, and you go through Area 2's linear experience to then jump back, and really the main choices there are, do you want to do 1, 2, 3 or 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1? What order do you do these in? And then how do you try to find your way through the encounter? But it is super linear, and at that point it's very focused on the writer of the module and their experience. And yes, I recognize that, I can change the modules, but if our goal is to experience the module, all of a sudden the ownership of the game really focuses more on the module. So we kind of have this spectrum of the desire to have it as player-focused as possible, and occasionally having moments where that may not feel like it's happening, and then trying to course correct. That way it very much is player-centered as much as possible. The player characters, it's the player character story, and it is a story built for the player characters. We then have the middle path where it's the player character story, but there's a whole bunch of structure built around them that really isn't their control, but is trying to highlight them, but it's still not their direct choices all the time. And then you have these modules where it's the player's experience, but the story being told is not the player character story. And so, yeah, having these perspectives on the gamut of like either actively played campaigns that I'm doing weekly now, or ones that have just recently kind of come to a close, having all of these different perspectives based off of, I just read this book, it is not my book, and just that viewpoint. So yeah, just these are ideas that I've had about how I've changed perspective on how I'm viewing a couple of my games, and I think it warranted the thought, because I'm going to have more games in the future that might be even more player-focused or even less player-focused, and trying to make sure I'm constantly tapping into, what does the table want? How much control does the table want? How much desire and consequences do the players want in the push of the narrative? And how much do they want more of a roller coaster experience where they are signing up for something that they know is a particular genre, a particular feel, and following a story that they want as opposed to a story that they choose? Seems kind of weird there, but some players are more experience driven, some players are more exploration driven, and making sure that I continue to tap into, okay, does this fit the story the players want and the ownership of the story that the players want? I had this moment of checking in with myself and checking in with the state of my campaigns and seeing the differences, knowing the differences, and making sure that we stay on the paths that the players want them to be on. Thanks for watching the video. It was made with the support of our patrons over on Patreon, where you can see behind-the-scenes content and the development of our own TTRPG systems. If you're looking to join a game, head on down to the description where we have a link to our Discord. You can join long-form campaigns, short mini-series for bite-sized narratives, or quick dips into systems you don't want a long-term commitment to, or you can join our Tower of Taziok. Tower of Taziok is a 5th edition infinite dungeon with roguelite elements, legacy play, and downtime synchronous with the real world. After you form a house of patronage, every week that passes in your life, your character gets a week of downtime. Everything else you can check out milestoneplay.com, and yeah, thanks for watching. Let's get going.